It's a great honor to be here with all of you today, the 36th Annual Presidential Lecture. First, let's please congratulate and thank Mina Jazz Quartet for that wonderful musical prelude. Matthew Nicholson, Ryan Smith, Murillo Hazenji, Rain Vitorino, thank you very much. It's great to see how thriving our musical program in college is. Thank you very much. Do you have another number? Yeah. Go. Once again, that's the Mina Jazz Quartet. Rain, Maria, Ryan, Matthew, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. I asked someone as we started, I said, how will I know when they're finished? And they said, well, you'll know. And then I leaned over to my wife, Mary. I take full responsibility for this. And she said, well, when everybody applauds. So I'm sorry, but thank you. What a wonderful, wonderful 3 pieces. Thank you very much. James O. Friedman started this program 36 years ago. If you turn over the back of your program, you'll see the distinguished lecturers we've had over these many years. I've been here 4 years, but my cursory glance says that's a who's who of our past and our future. And it gives me great honor and comfort to introduce today's speaker. This program showcases the best of our faculty. I'd like to thank the committee that works so hard, seems like all year round, to select each year's speaker. And through this forum, we not only get to see the front edge of so many fields, but we also hopefully bring together so much of our community across a number of different disciplines to share our thinking. And hopefully many of you from the community are here as well, not from the university. That's by design. I think this is a wonderful program, and it really fills my heart that we're still adding a few chairs to fit all of us in. I often, when I'm out talking about the university, use the phrase when they say, what are you all about at the University of Iowa? And I use the phrase that we're developing leaders who will make a difference in our world. And I believe every word of that. It's the development, it's the world leading, and I think today's speaker is just a perfect example of that. And you'll see that unfold, I'm sure. The way I've chosen to do these introductions in the past, and will continue today, you can read the details of Karen's very impressive bio and her CV. And I'm sure many of you have already know it and now will read it. But instead, I'd like to actually reach into our community and say, tell me what you think of Karen. How does she work? How does she tick? Here's Mark Berg. Mark is a sociology professor, and in nominating Karen for the Regents Award for Faculty Excellence, Mark commented, "Nearly every serious student of crime and deviance will, at some point, become acquainted with Professor Heimer's contributions to the field. Her research on gender and crime is so influential that it often appears in the core materials of popular criminology textbooks," end quote. Another colleague, in nominating Karen to be a College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Collegiate Fellow, commented, and this is Jennifer Glanville, who I'm sure is here somewhere, and currently the sociology chair, commented, quote, "Professor Heimer's body of research can be characterized as applying rigorous quantitative methods to important theoretical questions in criminology. Today, Professor Heimer is one of the leading scholars of gender and crime." And she goes on to also praise Professor Heimer's ability to use her research expertise in ways that benefit our wider society, end quote. Karen's also known for being a remarkable teacher and mentor. Mark Berg, in his nomination letter, observed, "Professor Heimer has been a consistently excellent teacher and mentor during her time at the University of Iowa. Her accessible teaching style attracts students from a variety of disciplines, and she has a reputation for imparting a high degree of research sophistication to her students." Jennifer then also, in her nomination letter, noted appreciation for Karen's leadership role in establishing a new criminology law and justice major, which is still rapidly growing here at our university. Professor Glanville also goes on to note how a number of Karen's PhD students have gone on to have very successful careers. I think that's an issue many of us use to measure our impact in the world, which is how many of the next generation are we mentoring and tutoring. And in fact, when Karen's students speak of her caring and compassionate nature come to the fore very quickly. Let me share a couple of comments from former students that were gathered for a memory book in honor of Karen's presidency of the American Society of Criminology. Stacy DeCoster, Associate Professor of Sociology at North Carolina State University, shared the following, quote, "My accomplishments have been made possible because of Karen's guidance, encouragement, inspiration, and continued support. My stroll through memory lane includes hearing her knock on the door of my entirely unpresentable apartment the day I walked out of my comp because she took the trouble to stop by to see if I was okay." A more recent PhD, Steph Schuster, now assistant professor in the Lyman Briggs College and Department of Sociology at Michigan State, says, quote, "Karen is an amazing human. I didn't recognize until years later that most people who come through on campus on visit days are not taken out to dinner with the chair of the department. And I can only think that that was part of Karen's generosity and inclusivity efforts in ensuring that my partner and I felt welcome in Iowa City. I felt affirmed just being in an academic space and not worry about the receptiveness the department would put to the queer and trans." She then went on to say, "I aspire to model Karen's mentorship, compassion, commitment to scholarship, strong leadership, and advocacy." Karen is also just as supportive of her colleagues and junior faculty. As sociology professor, Mark Berg shared with me the outside of his nomination letter that I quoted earlier, that Karen is, quote, "a warm and generous person, qualities that make being here new to Iowa a more comfortable experience for me as a junior faculty member." Her colleague, Teresa Magnum, who I saw someone here a few minutes ago, professor of English and Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, and director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, has shared the following with me. As assistant professors, Karen and I started working together on a sailboat on Lake McBride, thanks to the great beginner course offered by the UI Sailing Club. I've learned so much from her in the years since. I seek out her brilliant analyses of crime and punishment wherever I hear claims about crime that don't quite ring true. but I've also been inspired by seeing the thoughtfulness, the integrity, and compassion she brings to all of her work at the university, from working with students to chairing a department. I should have known when I saw how she whipped those knots and sails into shape that she was going to be a friend and colleague I would happily follow into any number of future adventures. Well, I don't know if whipping knots and sails into shape is going to play very much in the rest of this afternoon's conversation, but Jennifer Glanville describes Karen as a triple threat who excels in all areas of faculty endeavor. I know you're going to see a great intellect, a tremendous talent, most importantly, a passion and dedication for her area of interest and expertise as she walks us through her particular topic. As I started off by saying, we're here to make a difference in our world, to train the next generation to do so. I welcome one of our leaders and mentors who is driving the next generation forward. Professor Heimer, the podium is yours. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for the comments. Thank you so much, President Harold. Thank you for selecting me to give this lecture. Thanks, everybody who shared such wonderful comments. I think we should just stop now and go home. This is a great honor for me. I appreciate it very much. And it was such a treat to hear the wonderful music as well. I really appreciate all of you, being here on this wintry Sunday. And I really want to thank all of my friends, colleagues, students, friends and folks from the community, and people from the community organizations who are here today. I know everybody has a lot to do on Sundays, and given the cold today, staying inside with a good book and a warm fire seems like it would have been a nice option. So thank you very much for coming today. I want to acknowledge my collaborator, Janet Lauritsen, at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who I work with on the research that I'll talk about today. As President Harold's comments indicated, I work in several different areas having to do with gender and crime, and today we're going to talk about one of those areas. I also want to take a moment to thank my daughters for coming home to be here today. They're my inspiration, and they actually subtitled the talk. Thank you. They're more creative than I am. And I especially want to thank Joe, my partner in life, and anybody who knows Joe, and I think a lot of you do, know that he's not only fun and super smart, but he's also very supportive. And sometimes I try him on that. And we sometimes work together, and he's actually a collaborator on some of the research that I'm going to talk about today. So when the news of this lecture came out, I got messages from several people who shared stories about how violence had touched their lives. And it was a bit of a Me Too moment for me. It reminded me of why it's important to talk about the issue of violence against women. It's important to study and talk about violence against women, in part because for so long it was almost completely hidden, or at least largely ignored. And even today, as we're hearing more through the mass and social media, much of the picture is still hidden from public view. Today, I can't speak about all of the ways that violence against women is hidden, but I can illuminate a few. First, the consequences and costs. The consequences and costs of violence are often too hidden, or at least not fully appreciated on the public stage. Second, the extent and patterns of violence against women are not widely known, even within the area of violence research more generally. These figures have been hidden, so to speak. Third, the extent of violence experienced by different groups of women is not well known. Indeed, we've not even had a good sense of levels of violent victimization in some groups. And fourth, what we do to help survivors of violence often happens behind the scenes and is hidden from the view of most of us. So let's talk for a minute about consequences and costs. When people are harmed by violence, the cost can be profound for the individuals, but also for communities and for us as a society. Violence creates a wide range of physical health consequences, as well as psychological consequences. It affects the woman's sense of safety and security, as well as our collective sense of safety and security. Because we all know someone who's experienced violence, it affects us all, and it affects all of our communities. And communities that experience higher rates of violence can experience an accumulation effect of sorts, where the collective experience can seem more devastating than the sum of the parts. The most available estimates on the cost of violence against women tend to focus on violence by intimate partners, by spouses, by partners, ex-spouses. The Centers for Disease Control has estimated that the lifetime cost is over $100,000 per woman who experiences intimate partner violence. They also estimate that collectively survivors lose 8 million days of paid work per year and 5.6 million days of household productivity. The CDC estimates that lifetime economic costs to the US population are about $3.6 trillion in the form of medical costs, lost productivity, criminal justice costs, and property damage. A report issued last March by CARE International estimated that violence against women costs upwards of 2% of the global GDP. This includes healthcare costs, other support for survivors, as well as the cost of lost work and education. Globally, CARE and the UN conclude violence against women presents barriers to poverty reduction and gender equality in the family, education, and the workplace. This affects all countries, but the United Nations report that came out last year shows that the countries with the greatest poverty rates are the most profoundly affected. I have to begin with a caveat about what I can address here today and what I can't. First, I'll largely focus on violence against women in the United States. Second, violence against women takes many forms, from stalking to human trafficking to homicide to assault. Other behaviors like sexual harassment can be considered a form of violence against women. And beyond this, researchers focus on many aspects of the problem, from documenting the extent to understanding the experiences of survivors to assessing specific interventions. There's a growing body of research on same-sex violence in intimate partner relationships and violence against the LGBTQ community. The field is, in short, very broad and impossible to capture in a single lecture. So today I'm going to speak about my own work in this area, which focuses on one slice of the work of research on violence against women. Specifically, I'm going to focus on patterns of physical violence against women, how much is occurring, what groups are most affected, and then make some comments about targeting policies and programs to aid survivors. Now, it's been only recently that we've been able to accurately assess the extent of violence against women. How much is occurring? Who's affected? When we talk about measuring the amount of violence in our country, people often think first about police agencies and the FBI. They collect lots of data. But police data are problematic for measuring most violence, with the exception of homicide. And this is because many acts of violence are never reported to the police. They're unknown to the police. And especially in the earlier years, society didn't really consider many acts of violence against women to be crimes, and so they weren't part of police reporting. This figure gives a quick indication of why we cannot use police reports of crime to study most forms of violence. Of all the violent crime that's committed in the United States, so the base of this pyramid, only about 45% is reported to police, and only 20% ends up in arrest. So more than half of all violent crime is unknown to police. And these figures include homicide, which is the best reported crime. If we remove homicide from the picture, then we see that even more serious violence is never reported to the police. In 2017, about 62% of assaults, serious assaults, 63% of robberies, and 75% of sexual assaults were not reported to the police. Now, there are a lot of reasons that people don't report to the police, including fear of retaliation, the belief that the police can't help. There's lots of reasons. The point is, we can't use police data to study the extent of violence in the United States, because if we did, we would miss most violence. And this is especially true for violence against women. The other data source for understanding violence in our country is the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a very large national survey of households in the United States. The survey began in 1973, and it's continuing. Every year it collects data from more than 100,000 households and over 200,000 people in those households. What the survey allows us to do is to get at the base of the pyramid, to assess how much violence is occurring in our country, even violence that's not reported to the police. So in the survey, people are asked about their experiences with violence of all kinds. They're asked a series of questions about what happened, where it happened, who did it, was it a spouse, intimate partner, ex-partner, family member, friend, acquaintance, stranger, on and on. The one form of physical violence that's not included in this survey is homicide, but homicide is the rarest form of violence, contrary to what we see on television. And thankfully, it accounts for less than half of a percentage point of all serious violence experienced by women in 2016. So by far, by miles, the most common forms of physical violence against women are assaults, rapes and sexual assaults, and robberies, which are best measured by victimization surveys. But before we talk about these more prevalent forms of violence, I do want to just take a quick look at homicide, especially because that's all that's on TV, so if I don't, people will think I'm not a real violence researcher. So let's just take a quick look. Females are the victims of about 21% of all homicides in the United States. Males are the victims of about 78%. However, the very distinctive feature of female homicide is that in about a third of the cases, women are murdered by what we call intimate partners, spouses, ex-spouses, boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, whereas only about 2% of men are murdered by intimate partners. This finding has been pretty consistent over time and was actually very important for calling attention to violence against women, which didn't really start happening big time until the 90s. And this is not just a pattern in the United States. Just quickly, a recent study by the UN shows that the proportion of male to female homicides holds at the global level, about 80% male, 20% female, and a little over a third of all murders of women globally are by intimate partners. So the picture is actually quite similar to the United States. Now, homicide's much more rare than any other kind of violence, and to get a sense of a difference in the just kind of numbers, magnitude, in 2016, there were roughly 17,000 homicides in the United States, which is actually a huge number. We kind of lead the industrialized world there. But there were over 5 million non-fatal violent victimizations, so about 400 times more non-fatal violence. Add to this the fact that the homicide rate for women is so much lower than men, and it's clear that to understand the picture of violence against women, we have to move beyond homicide and we have to examine other forms of violence. But it's actually been only fairly recently that we've been able to do this. Janet Lauritsen and I got a grant a while back to create some consistent estimates of violence against women and men over time using the National Crime Victimization Survey. And when we looked at the data over time, we were kind of surprised. As criminologists, we knew that violent crime had begun to decline sharply in the late 1990s. But when we disaggregated the data into female and male rates, we saw something a little surprising. We saw that females did not benefit in the same way that men did from the crime decline. So we published this study using the data through 2004. We claimed that the difference in serious violence against males and females was closing over time. So females were accounting for a larger share of all violent victimizations over time, and the gender gap was closing. The area in blue captures the difference between men and women's rates. It's a gender gap. This was news because previously nobody had built a data file to be able to see what was happening to non-fatal violence against women over time. Recently, we updated the data to see what had happened. We claimed the gap was closing, but it hadn't closed actually completely. But we updated the data recently to see what's happening to male and female victimization since 2004. And this is what we found. Not only did the narrowing of the gender gap continue out past 2004, but it became very small in recent years. The picture is actually quite stunning. Men and women used to be quite different in their experiences of serious violent victimization. And at this point in time, they are amazingly similar. In fact, as of 2014, the female rate of non-fatal, serious violent victimization exceeded the male rate for the first time. And this continued in 2015 and 2016, which is the last year for which we have data. This is serious violence. So serious physical assault, sexual assaults, rapes, and robbery. So females in the United States today are experiencing a bit more serious violence than our males. This is absolutely unprecedented. As an aside, our colleagues in the UK, they're the only other country actually that has an annual victimization survey of violence. They're seeing similar things in recent years. They're seeing a similar pattern. So the great violence drop of the US benefited both men and women. You can see that. It benefited both. But the female rate did not decline as much as the male rate and has held steady in recent years while the male rate dipped a bit. So today, females are experiencing slightly more serious violence than males. So I always like to use a medical analogy here. If both male and female rates for heart attacks decreased, but female rates did not decrease as much as males and came to outstrip male rates, I think that would be cause for great concern. And I think that should be the case with violence as well. Now, remember when we examined homicide in the US and around the world a few minutes ago, that we saw that there's a very important gender difference in that women are much more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner than are men. This is true for violence beyond homicide as well. These are a bit of a different type of graphic. These are stacked graphs, and they show the proportion or chunk of all serious violence that's accounted for by strangers, which is in the brown, known others in the green, and intimate partners in the yellow. They show it separately for males and females, and for the chunk for each year on this graph. So violence by strangers was the most frequent type of violence in the 1980s and early 1990s for both sexes. The rates of violence by strangers were quite high during these years. And those rates then declined dramatically for men and women starting in the mid-late 90s. Another fact that's revealed by these graphs is that over the past few years, stranger violence was still the most common form of violence against men. About 67% of all serious violence against men is committed by strangers, and that's followed by violence by known other people, so families, friends, acquaintances. For men, just as in the case of homicide, violence by intimate partners is very low, and only a small part of the story of serious violence against men. It's the thin yellow strip at the bottom. It's actually about 3% in the later years. In the case of females, the chunk of all violence by strangers, the brown, also declined a great deal in the late 90s and early 2000s. Yet stranger violence accounts for a third of all serious violence against women over the past few years, Violence by intimate partners accounts for 22% of all serious violence against women. So there's a big gender difference in the intimate partner violence, but it's also the case that women are experiencing violence by strangers and by known others at significant rates as well. So this is to show that the story of violence against women must examine who is committing the violence. And the story's different for men and women. And intimate partner violence is very important, but it's not the whole story of violence against women. Okay, so let's talk about which groups of women have the highest risk for violence. Before we started our work, we knew about some of the likely patterns across groups based on past research on men's violent victimization and also some of the research on women's risk for violence, including some smaller surveys that were conducted in the 1990s. So the major factors that we expected to be linked to risk for violence are age, race and ethnicity, income, and where people live, urban, suburban, or rural. Lots of research shows that teens and younger adults have the highest risk of experiencing violence. African Americans have the highest rate of violent victimization. However, this story turns out to be a bit more complicated, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Research tends to find that living in poverty is associated with higher risk for violence, and again, that's not so simple either as we dig deeper. And studies of non-lethal violence and homicide tend to find that the highest rates of violent victimization happen in urban areas. Now, the problem with all of this is that it's oversimplified. These are very broad categories, and they may be too crude for actually understanding who is at risk for violence, for the most violence. One of the core insights of feminist research is that we cannot make sweeping statements about the experiences of Black women or Latino women or young women or urban women or poor women. The intersectionalities approach says that experiences may vary depending on how all these factors come together to shape the lives of particular individuals. So young, poor, urban Black women may have very different experiences than young, poor, rural Black women, or young, middle-class, urban, or rural Black women. And to complicate things further, these risk patterns can and do vary across the type of violence. So the experiences of these subgroups with stranger violence may or may not translate directly into the experiences with intimate partner violence. So based on this kind of reasoning, Janet Lauritsen, Joe Lang, and I received a grant to put together a very large data file of over 10 million interviews from all of the years of the National Crime Victimization Survey. And with this large data file, we have enough information to analyze different forms of serious violence for the many race, income, place of residence, etc. subgroups. So we use this very large file to estimate the risks of different forms of violence across the many subgroups in the US. And I'm just going to share a few of those findings with you. Don't worry. So first I want to focus on serious violence by strangers. Recall that violence by strangers is a substantial chunk of all violence against women. It's about a third. Despite this, there was no large-scale research, it's about a third recently even, there was no large-scale research on this form of violence against women before we did our research. Nobody was studying stranger violence against women. And we're talking here about serious physical assaults, including aggravated assaults, sexual assaults and rape, and robberies by strangers. So we started by looking at the race difference, because a lot of the research on stranger violence focuses, among men, focuses on race differences. We find that if we look only at race differences and we don't consider anything else, we just do the broad brush, African American and Latina women have higher risks of being harmed by a stranger than do white women. The sizes of the figures here show the differences in overall risk. But we find when we consider other factors, like age, poverty levels, where people live, that these differences disappear. So without considering any other factors, we see that African American women are about 40% more likely than white women to experience violence from strangers, and Latinas are about 25% more likely than white women to also experience violence from strangers. In the case of Latinas, if we simply take into account that they are younger as a group than white women, we find that the risk of stranger violence becomes the same as the risk for white women. So the fact that this group is younger than the white group actually explains the difference in risk. In the case of African Americans, if we take into account that Black women are more likely to live in urban areas and more likely to be poor, we find that African American risks of stranger violence become the same as white risk. Another way of saying this is that if Black women lived in the same places and had the same levels of poverty as white women in this country, there would be no difference in the rate of victimization by strangers across the races. So this suggested to us that to better understand what's going on with African American as compared to white women, we need to harness the power of our very large data file and examine race by place by poverty subgroups. And here's what we discovered. This graphic shows comparisons of rates for the groups that are noted here. When we compare Blacks and whites who live in urban and rural areas, we find that Black and white urban women are just about as equally to be the victims of stranger violence. Poverty plays a role too, and it increases risk for both Blacks and whites by about 40%. This leads us to conclude that the higher risk of stranger violence against Black women is not due to something about their lives in cities compared to white women's lives in cities in and of itself. Instead, you can see that the risk of violence is about the same for white and Black urban women, and that means that the reason that Black women as a group experience more stranger violence is mainly because a larger fraction of the Black population is living in urban areas and a larger fraction is poor. Another interesting pattern is that living in a city increases the risk of stranger violence more for Blacks than whites, although the Black and the white rate is the same once you take into account all these other factors once in the urban area. Moving from rural area to cities increases stranger violence more for Blacks than whites because it turns out that stranger violence is lower for rural Black women than it is for rural white women. Rural white women are 2 times more likely than rural Black women to experience stranger violence. Now let's take a look at serious violence, against serious violence by intimate partners, which includes the current and ex-partners, boyfriends, spouses, and so on. And here what we see is we have to take into account multiple intersecting dimensions to describe the risk that we observe in the data. Specifically, we have to consider how race, income, and marital status come together to create differences in risk. Let's take a look at a few of the subgroups. We'll look at Black women and white women who are poor and middle class, and married versus separated. Let's look first at African American women's experience with intimate partner violence. First, we see that living in poverty increases Black women's risk for both married women and for women who are separated. And we may ordinarily think that just the poverty effects themselves are pretty strong. Look at the married middle class compared to the married poor women, for example. But these effects pale in comparison to the impact of being separated. Black women who are separated have many times higher risk of being seriously harmed by an intimate partner than Black women who are married. And this holds for both poor and middle-class women. Now let's take a look at the situation for white women. Some interesting things. First, like black women, married white women who live in poverty experience more intimate partner violence than married white middle-class women. And married white and married black women are really not very different in terms of their risk for violence. But look at that. When we look at the risk for both poor and middle-class white women who are separated, we find that it's just off the charts. A separated white poor woman's risk is about 16 times that of a married poor white woman. And it's also higher than the risk for separated poor black women, although being separated increases the risk greatly for black women as well. And this situation is actually not much better for middle-class separated women. So the conditions that accompany separation for both white and black women increase the risk of violence by intimate partners, and this is magnified in the case of white women. Agencies who serve survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence know that women who are separated and divorced have to cope with these realities. But perhaps what's less known is the race difference and the impact that exists on middle-class women as well. So I just want to make some comments about policy. The kind of work that we're doing, uncovering changes over time in women's as compared to men's victimization rates, and in our other work where we're using large amounts of survey data to identify the risks of race, class, place, marital status intersections, can help increase our understanding of violence against women and can inform policy. First, because women's rates now exceed men's, I think we can say that we can't ignore women's experiences with violence any longer. Second, we validate the focus on violence by intimate partners by showing that it comprises a good chunk of all violence against women, but we also show that we can't ignore violence against women from strangers and other non-intimates. Third, the kind of subgroup analysis that we've been doing can be deployed to help pinpoint groups who may need extra or special services. It can show where and under what conditions we may need to work on increasing services and how we may best target culturally responsive services. For example, our work emphasizes that we need to attend to stranger violence against women, particularly in urban areas. Most of the focus on stranger violence tends to be on men, but our findings suggest that programs need to consider gender-responsive supports that address issues that women may be more likely to face than male survivors of stranger violence, such as impacts on family caregiving and gender-based feelings of insecurity when we walk down the street. The work I showed today also emphasizes that both black and white separated women are likely to need more services and perhaps more specialized supports than other categories of women. Before I turn to make a few comments about our local organizations, which I want to close with, I want to mention that something about the funding landscape for work on violence against women, for support services and research on programming. This work has been helped immensely by the National Violence Against Women Act, which was passed initially in 1994. It was reauthorized in 2000, in 2005, in 2013, and it was up for reauthorization in 2018. Congress hasn't reauthorized yet. They failed to do that before the shutdown, the government shutdown. And there was some concern about lapse in funding because of this. But I have read that Congress will consider reauthorizing and better reauthorize next month. This funding is very important to a wide range of organizations in our country. Finally, I want to emphasize that there are many organizations across the country now that focus on supporting women who have experienced violence. Some states and communities have been supporting excellent work. There are places where the support and services are sorely lacking. In Iowa, we have active state coalitions focusing on domestic violence and on intimate partner violence, and on sexual assault, domestic violence and sexual assault. And we're very lucky to have excellent and energetic organizations that are based in our own community. They provide support to survivors, engage in education and outreach, work hard to challenge the culture around violence against women. Part of what they do is to get the word out, to uncover what's hidden, to draw attention to violence against women. And I just want to say something about 4 of the larger organizations. There are others. Our Rape Victim Advocacy Program, which was begun in 1973 and was one of the earliest of its kind in the nation, still retains an affiliation with the University of Iowa. Although it's funded largely these days by state, federal, and other grants, it serves our campus and the community, as well as 8 counties in southeast Iowa. The Women's Resource and Action Center on our campus provides support, educational, and cultural change work, including the work of the Men's Anti-Violence Coalition, which is aimed at engaging men on campus to help change the culture around violence. The Domestic Violence Intervention Program offers emergency shelter, outreach support, counseling, and education about domestic and intimate partner violence to our community and also to the 8 counties served by RVAP. Its resources for emergency shelter have been stretched very thin since it's been required to serve all these counties. And as you might imagine, it's very difficult for women in some of the rural areas, in rural counties, to get to Iowa City for shelter when they need emergency shelter. So the DVIP outreach staff work hard, they're amazing, work hard to find safe spaces in rural areas for women who need to leave a bad situation. Monsoon is another organization that serves survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in Asian and Pacific Islander communities in Iowa. And it is statewide in scope. It has a multilingual staff and volunteers, and they log a lot of miles to support women in the state. I spoke with the directors of some of these organizations when I was preparing for today, and I was more impressed than ever by the energy and commitment of the people who work in those organizations. But the funding landscape has become more challenging in recent years. 5 years ago, there was statewide reorganization that increased the coverage of RVAP and DVIP to the 8 counties. But funding's declined at the same time for some services, and this has affected all of our local agencies. So they're being asked to do more with less. The directors of these organizations are creatively raising resources to promote support for survivors and their other missions, which are also important. There are quite a few students in my classes, maybe some here today, who provide very important volunteer services that help all of these organizations to achieve their missions. And when I asked the directors what they could most use from our community, because I wanted to share it with all of you, they said volunteers are vital, donations are always welcome, and information is on their website. And actually for DVIP, they take donations of all kinds, not just money, but things that women need when they leave, like toiletries. And the directors said that it is so important, beyond this, it is so important for people in the community to help get the word out about the problem. So I'm so happy to see all of you here today. To help get the word out about the problem, their programs, and the need to work to change the culture. To get the word out, they said, to reveal what is too often hidden. And I leave you with that. Thank you. you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So kind. You're very generous. I think we have time for a question or so. Yes.
I do a lot of volunteer work for Amnesty International, and I noticed one group you didn't talk about here was Native American women.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes. Native American women have very high rates of violent victimization by all of the others that we talked about. In fact, addressing Native American violence is very complicated because of laws governing what can be done on and off reservations, for example, in terms of enforcing law. We actually have on our list, as part of this, we have enough, it's been very hard to study violence against Native Americans because if we rely on police data, we've got a bias. The surveys, even though they survey 200,000 people a year, that's not enough data to actually get at some of the kind of questions we want to ask about what's happening for Native American women. But now that we've been able to pool like these millions of records of data, we will be able to move into the area of trying to do some of these assessments that we've been doing with African American and white and Latina women, for example, with Native American women. But they are a group that has very high rates of violence. In fact, their rates are the highest.
Indigenous women all over the world have that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Another question? Yes.
Can you list a few major causes for the violence against women in this country?
I didn't hear.
Can you list a few
Oh,
causes for the violence against
yeah. I think it's we call it in sociology, we call that structural and cultural. So structurally, when women are in positions of less power than men, they are going to be more exposed to control by men. And culturally, when we live in societies that don't consider harming women, particularly harming women in your own home, to be a crime, it's very hard to reduce violence against women. So more equality and changing cultures. And I think those two things go hand in hand. You can't take them apart. And the UN has actually, as you, I think, are alluding to, the UN has found that some of the the highest rates of intimate partner homicide, which is what they can study, the homicide, some of the highest rates of intimate partner homicide are in some of the poorest countries of the world. Yes, I guess we have time for one more, and then I probably should let President Harold tell us what comes next. Yes?
Thank you so much for the amazing talk. I was wondering, on the spectrum from nothing to outright violence or abuse, it seems like there are many stages where predators see the line of where the legal limit is and kind of operate right here.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, what are the barriers to creating accountability or for lowering maybe the legal threshold so that those behaviors can be criminalized before it gets to a point of outright violence?
So that's a really tough problem. And as a social scientist, it's actually a really tough problem for measurement because, I'll say that before I talk about your question about the law. So I don't know if everyone heard the question. The question was, okay, sorry, I'll repeat. The question was, and I would say that this is more in the case of intimate partner violence, or to some extent acquaintance violence, but more intimate partner violence. There are a lot of behaviors that can happen. There are a lot of behaviors that happen in a relationship, for example, where there's kind of increasing levels all the time of control and psychological abuse. And the threshold to reach were then this happens before perhaps violence, out and out violence, physical violence is occurring. Once physical violence is occurring, the law kicks in, or it can kick in, although we saw that like 62, 70% doesn't, so. But the law can kick in. And so the question was, what are barriers to lowering that limit? And I have two answers. One is about what we know about it, the research, or what we know about how much there is, the research. And two is about what we could do anyway. So the first is that, and this is actually happening in the UK right now. I work with some folks in the UK who study similar kinds of things, and there's been a move in the UK in the victimization survey to sort of take away the measurement of physical violence and focus only on what is called coercive control, which is what you're talking about. And so they're talking about changing their victimization survey so that it would be hard to even take apart those two things. And the reason for that, I mean, the reason that people want to see a measure of how much coercive control there is very good, because a lot of times there's sort of escalation in these relationships, which is what the question referenced. But the problem for measurement is that the Brits are pretty concerned about right now, or some of them anyway, is that if you take away the ability to measure how much physical violence there is because you sort of wrap it all up in a bigger ball of wax, it may be that we have less power to try and make change based on our findings, because there will always be some people who say, well, that's not physically harming. And so that's one reason I didn't even show you our results for total violence, which includes battery and simple assault. I'm showing you that we can make huge statements based on super serious stuff. So maybe it's just the stage we're at of research, starting there. The other thing is that we got like 75% of rapes and sexual assaults and over 60% of all this other violence against women, other kinds of physical assaults, and actually serious physical assault, aggravated assault, is the most common form. We have, over 60% of those that never even get reported to the police, and then when they're reported to the police, like some small percentage is anything's being done about. And so I feel like raising the coercive behaviors, I feel like we're just not there yet. Raising the coercive behaviors to the level of police or legal intervention just becomes tricky, because we can't even do it with serious violence. Maybe the next generation. I'll be retired.
Sure. Well, speaking for, I suspect, all in the room, we hope you aren't retired soon. What comes next? I think these types of sessions are not only useful to inform us, but I hope they would call us to action. If we're going to truly make a difference in our world and step into these types of challenges, let's not only receive, but let's react on what we've heard. I think part of the learning process, at least with the students I work with, is it's one thing to listen to a talk like this, but it's another thing to own it and reflect on it and figure out each individually in your own way. What are you going to do? What am I going to do? I think, in fact, together, we can make a huge difference. I think we've made a huge difference in some of the issues like high-risk drinking in our community. We've got a long way to go, but I think we've made an impact. Part of us just talking about it, understanding it, and making it okay to help those in need. Karen, thank you ever so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I think it's inspired all of us. I encourage all of us to not only reflect on this, but also to go downstairs here in a few moments and join us for a reception. Thank you once again.